With the Switch 2 barreling over the horizon, there are essentially two schools of thought with regard to the fate of Switch 1. One approach would hold that there needs to be a definitive shift from one system to another, and that without Nintendo going all out on support for Switch 2 and cutting off Switch at the knees, the older console will remain a drag on Nintendo's successor console and actually hurt the company long term. Another approach is that the Switch has a massive install base, and so it makes sense to nurse the Switch on for as long as possible, following other recent consoles in having a very substantial period of offering dual support. Now, of course, there are many gradations of opinion between these two extremes, and there are perhaps some other considerations unique to the Switch that might suggest different options, but in this video, I want to explore some of the factors that might affect the fate of the original Switch. We should start, as so often in these videos, by familiarizing ourselves with the history of Nintendo's console transitions. The 3DS was the most recent console to be retired, and because the Switch was not initially a direct replacement for it, it's a little tricky to establish exactly when it was superseded, but original first-party games continued to be released for the console until March 2019, after the 8th anniversary of the 3DS, and more than 2 years after the Switch launched, although before the September 2019 release of the Switch Lite, which arguably was the 3DS's most direct successor. The console continued to be sold in statistically significant numbers up until the end of the 2020 to 2021 financial year, giving it a healthy 10-year run on the market. There have long been rumours that there were further 3DS games which were, according to various tellings, either scrapped or moved to Switch once it became clear that Switch was indeed a success. This seems plausible, but probably overblown. The Switch's high demand was clear enough from the outset that, at the very least, it was unlikely to be a Wii U-style failure, and if you assume late-era 3DS games took about 2 years to develop, then it seems likely that any game that was originally mooted for 3DS would only have been in very early conceptual development. Of course, looking at this as a precedent for the Switch would lead us to believe that the Switch may have a very healthy lifespan yet. The equivalent of this sales trajectory would be new first-party Switch 1 games through to mid-2027, and further game sales until 2029. But the 3DS is an outlier among Nintendo consoles, probably for the reasons I've already outlined. Quite what the final games were of previous systems can be a little muddy to determine, given that simultaneous international releases are still a relatively new phenomenon, but the Wii U's final game is not ambiguous at all. Zelda Breath of the Wild served as the passing of the torch from the Wii U to the new Switch, and from that point on, barring a brief mention of the Wii U for the Breath of the Wild DLC, the Wii U was essentially never heard from again. Similarly, the Wii basically shut up shop for new first-party games before the Wii U even arrived on the scene. Despite being an astonishingly popular console, the sales of the machine had gone off a cliff in its final 2 years, and Nintendo dumped it fairly unceremoniously, huge install base and all. And going back and back, this pattern can also be seen. Nintendo essentially stopped bothering with the GameCube in 2006, except for a cross-gen release of Zelda Twilight Princess, just as the N64 had also been defenestrated to make way for the GameCube. If you go back to the Super NES, the transition was a little blurrier, with Kirby's Dream Land 3 hitting the Super NES in 1997 in America and 1998 in Japan, despite being on a machine that had been comprehensively succeeded. Similarly, and see if you can spot a pattern, Kirby's Adventure launched on the NES a couple of years after the Super NES had launched. In the handheld space, things are also mixed. Nintendo published Final Fantasy VI Advance in 2007, years after the DS's launch, while Pokémon Black 2 and White 2 were both major titles for the Nintendo DS over a year after the 3DS hit shelves. Then again, both the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color came to fairly clean ends, despite the Game Boy having an astonishingly long shelf life, with it being released first in 1989 and the Game Boy Color only truly being superseded in 2001, a full 12 years later. Basically, we can categorize Nintendo consoles into the two camps we outlined before. The transitions which were, let's say, hawkish on cutting ties with the past consoles include the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, N64, GameCube, Wii, and Wii U. The transitions which were a little more dovish and continued support up to and even slightly more than 2 years after being superseded include the NES, Super NES, Game Boy Advance, DS, and 3DS. Now, these two groups of consoles are each quite diverse, but there are some commonalities. The N64, GameCube, Wii, and Wii U all had in common that the systems were, at the point at which they were superseded, seen as failures that the company wanted to move away from. Obviously, the Wii was once tremendously successful, but its 2010 to 2011 numbers were barely half the previous year, and it only went downhill from there. While the GameCube might be well remembered for its game library in retrospect, but didn't convince the world in the sales department. Nintendo at this time was a significantly smaller company, and with their development resources stretched between home consoles and handhelds, they inevitably had to make a decisive break with their old systems in order to support the new ones. With the Game Boy, on the other hand, that system had experienced such a long life, distended still further by the late era emergence of the Game Boy Color, that arguably Nintendo left it as long as it was reasonable. Although now recalled as a crazy mid-90s experiment like tie-dye t-shirts and yo-yos, I suspect that Nintendo did harbour some hopes that the Virtual Boy could have been a Game Boy successor. And it was certainly released at the kind of time that the Game Boy could expect to be superseded under ordinary circumstances. That the monochrome handheld lasted as long as it did may owe more to the astonishing success of Pokemon in 1996 than strict planning, but it's understandable that by 1999 they were pretty much running on fumes for Game Boy content. On the other hand, there are commonalities among the consoles which continued as well. In the case of Game Boy Advance and 3DS, these were both the final iteration in their previous lines, with Nintendo introducing the Nintendo DS and the Switch as experimental third pillar consoles. They went on to be incredible successes, but before launch, Nintendo may have feared another Virtual Boy style disaster, and so they would have wanted to hedge their bets. This being the case, it is hardly a surprise that the consoles continue for a long time. You couldn't say that about the 3DS though, and yet releasing Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 on the DS was a very big move by the Pokemon Company. It's true that the Pokemon Company has traditionally liked to continue supporting older consoles with larger install bases, especially of their younger skewing fan base, but this was an extreme way to support an old console. However, with the game explicitly building on Black and White, it would have been quite difficult and needlessly time-consuming to remake the world in such a way that fit the greater power profile of the 3DS. I wonder if it also soft confirms a widely held suspicion I've seen, which is that Nintendo rushed the 3DS to market because they were concerned about rampant piracy. This would explain why, despite to this day being the best-selling console Nintendo ever put out, it had a decent, but by Nintendo standards, fairly pedestrian, 6 years 3 months on the market before its successor launched, and that when the 3DS did appear, many felt the game's lineup was somewhat undercooked. If Black 2 and White 2 had been commissioned at a point where it was believed that the DS had a year longer than turned out to have been the case, it only makes sense that those games ended up on the DS without it necessarily being Nintendo's Plan A. As for the NES and Super NES, things are also rather murky. There were cross-gen titles like Mario's Time Machine on NES and Super NES, but the main title that stood out among the late NES adventures was Kirby's Adventure. The commonality with all the late Kirby titles is their strong appeal to young children, who of course are going to be a larger portion of the active user bases of late-era consoles. What's not evident is that Nintendo is overly sentimentally attached to maintaining a previous install base just for the sake of being able to offer sales. However, that's not to say that I expect a rug pull finish to the Switch either. We've already seen a transition in the kinds of titles that are coming to the console, with more adventure games and visual novels, more Mario games and spin offs, even by Nintendo standard, and more low key ports. These all fit the profile of games that would likely not appeal to hardcore Nintendo fans who might have bought these games before or not be so interested in the casual titles, but might appeal to more casual players. And so, in this sense, if Nintendo has a market ready made, it only makes sense to continue to sell into that market. The longer they can engage people with Nintendo content, the better. Nintendo also has a great advantage now that it did not previously, specifically the ability to offer online only titles. In theory, there's no reason why Nintendo Switch Online shouldn't continue to offer legacy Switch owners, air quotes, new content indefinitely. We know that Nintendo has emulators for the GameCube and Wii at least, as we've seen them in use for games like Super Mario 3D All Stars, and although the DS could potentially prove a bit more taxing to emulate, they found solutions for the Wii U after all. Even if there are only a small number of titles that are fully supported on Switch 1, it still seems like a good way to keep people hooked in to the old console. Moreover, they have pushed people to be multiple Switch households in recent years, and so it would seem odd now to abandon all these past devices when they are so keen to push out big group multiplayer experiences. Everybody Want to Switch and Super Mario Party Jamboree are on one level the kinds of experiences you can only have with a massive install-based console, where you're confident that many people will get in on the game. But while Everybody Want to Switch linked people with their phones, the potential to link people into a multiplayer experience using a legacy Switch seems tremendous. Quite how this would work is difficult to fully predict. I doubt we'll see people being asked to buy 8 copies of the game for an 8-player experience, but if people on the same Wi-Fi network and perhaps on NSO could receive invitations to be able to join in a limited functionality version of the same game, I could see this keeping the salience of the Switch going for a long time. After all, Nintendo has always had a higher and a lower tier offer in the console and handheld device space, and sometimes they've actually had more different levels. When Switch 2 launches, the high end will be secured, but I suspect they will want to secure the low priced end of the market, at least until Switch 2 Lite comes along. But equally, they're not going to want to spend resources of their own to any great extent, and this is where companies like HAL come in. Yes, Kirby is co-owned with Nintendo, but HAL still developed for the character and has a huge sway over all aspects of the puffball, and having him arrive late in console lifespans clearly suits them, as it allows him to debut on a larger, younger skewing install base. I doubt Nintendo has any disagreements to this front, but even if they were to have concerns, it would hardly matter, as HAL is an independent company, and I doubt Nintendo would go to war with them over a judgment like this. However, a further wrinkle is that the Switch 2 is backward compatible at a time when generational jumps are seemingly less dramatic. A game like Famicom Detective Club is likely to be played by salarymen on the Tokyo Metro and crime fiction loving women who might not be up to speed with the latest game systems but know what they like. While physical editions of these sorts of titles would make most sense on Switch 2, unless the next Famicom Detective Club or another Code game or others in the same genre really lean into Switch 2 specific features, quite possible considering mouse mode, there's otherwise every reason for them to offer a version of the game like this for legacy Switch owners as well as for Switch 2 players. Is Famicom Detective Club going to tip many people into buying a new console? Well, maybe eventually, but it's going to be a fairly minor number, and in the meantime, Mages is going to want to scoop up as many people as it can get to buy their title. This is where the large install base counts, when a particular subsegment is still active and the properties in question are not critical to the success of the subsequent console. The possibility of one or two cross-gen games aside, Nintendo's major franchises need to be on the new machine to oblige people to upgrade expeditiously. As the 3DS shows, once momentum is lost, it's possible, but far more difficult, to build back again. However, there remain many audiences that will be tied to Switch for some time, including potentially many younger Mario fans. Mario and Luigi's final outing on 3DS did not exactly set the world ablaze, but I find it difficult to imagine that Nintendo won't want to burn off some of its Mario archive titles with ports and low-effort remakes aimed at younger children who are not yet the major audience for Switch 2, but could be enticed into the Nintendo ecosystem on Switch 1, perhaps for the first time, through a well-judged movie-adjacent advertising campaign. Another innovation that we've seen used on Switch, albeit not very much by Nintendo themselves, is game streaming. Japanese internet connections haven't always been that strong, but reportedly, rollout of fiber broadband has been good, and it raises the possibility that streaming may be more practical for a greater number of gamers going forward. While I can't see Nintendo themselves wishing to take much advantage of this, it may make sense for third parties who would like to be able to open their Switch 2 exclusives up to the vaster Switch 1 audience, and so it feels plausible that third parties could continue to support the Switch 1 in some limited ways for a while yet. As for indies, how many indie titles really push the graphical boat out to that extent? Those that do would clearly not want to sink the money into having two versions, but for the most part it feels quite believable that indie games could be released for Switch 1 indefinitely, given the size of that market. A further source of potential Switch 1 games is GameCube and Wii ports. Perhaps the odd title like F-Zero GX could really benefit from a thorough reimagining for a new console, but if we're talking Pikmin 1 plus 2 style offerings, then there's no real reason at all to limit sales just to the newer console. Until or unless Nintendo decide to commit to GameCube on Nintendo Switch Online, there is a wealth of games that could be given relatively low effort ports. So, what might the last years of the Switch 1 look like? Kirby's recent success on Switch may make them more reluctant to burn off a Kirby title on an outdated system and keener to go for broke with a bigger game, especially if they have a title that releases this year just before the Switch 2 drops. However, the same pressures that caused HAL to bring up the rear on NES, SNES, Wii, and 3DS makes me feel there's at least a 50% chance of a new Kirby title for Switch 1 after Switch 2 launches. Then there are multiplayer titles such as WarioWare and possibly the odd online title that may work on both. Boxboy and such like, even Pushmo. Add in third parties allowing Switch 2 games to stream, and indies and Switch owners could feel relatively well taken care of through to 2027, when Nintendo is likeliest to have a Switch 2 Lite model, which would require sidelining the Switch 1 to a greater degree. Of course, there is the potential for Switch to go on and on and on. Imagine if they released a true Switch Mini, perhaps with a screen only marginally smaller than the Switch Lites, but with no bezel, so the total footprint of the console would be significantly smaller. They could probably sell this at an extreme bargain price, let's say $129, and with the vast number of games it could play, it could thrive for quite a while. They continued to shift 2DS until the end of the 2019 to 20 financial year, and that console operated in a similar space. Absolutely bare bones, but allowing the player access to an enormous library. Do they need to support such a console with games? Unlikely, when the library is already going to be so rich with titles from the decades, and while Nintendo Switch Online also offers additional, air quotes, new content. On balance, I feel Nintendo will want to avoid splitting attention from their next generation, and so a late in life new console feels probably only about 30% likely to me at this stage. One thing about Nintendo, though, is that they can be stubborn about their approach to consoles, and while most companies and even previous iterations of Nintendo may have wanted to make a hard change from Switch to Switch 2, I could see them continuing to find value in such a console indefinitely, and I think it is 70% likely that they will still be racking up at least a trickle of Switch 1 sales in 2027, and 50% likely that they still will be in 2028 as well. However, I don't think this necessarily will involve them committing full game resources to new games, and so my hunch is that it's only 50% likely that we'll see new first party retail releases for Switch 1 after March 2026, since in this respect it suits them to do a harder transitions than some previous. Thank you as ever to the Patreon supporters of this channel. Thank you for watching, liking, sharing, commenting and subscribing, and I shall catch you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.